Hello listeners, welcome back to Luke's English podcast. How are you doing? Hope you're doing fine today. Now in this episode, it's story time again. I'm going to read you a story. So this will be your chance, hopefully, to understand and enjoy a story in English. There's a PDF for this one, which you can download either from my website on the episode page for this episode, or you can download it directly using the link that you will find in the description of this episode in your podcast app that you're using, or on YouTube if you're watching there. Okay, so check out the PDF if you'd like to be able to read the story that you're listening to me read to you in this episode. Okay, in fact, we're going to start looking at the PDF right now. So let me go to that. Here we go. Right, so this episode is called The Adventure of the Speckled Band by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Here are some things I should say first before I start reading out the story to you. First of all, the English that you'll hear. So this is fairly complex, old-fashioned English. This story was published in 1892, and so the English is pretty old-fashioned. Compared to today's English, the main difference is that everything seems more formal in style. Victorian society, which is, you know, this story was written in the Victorian era. Victorian society was generally a lot more formal than ours is today, and this is reflected in the language with its long, complex sentences and vocabulary. But overall, it's not too different to the English we use today. It's not like Shakespeare, for example, which is very difficult for most people to understand fully these days. I think the vast majority of the vocabulary used here is still applicable today, and in fact, a lot of it is beautiful and descriptive language, which I find very enjoyable to read, and hopefully you will find enjoyable to listen to. But I understand it might be difficult to understand. Hopefully, my quick explanations and synonyms and things will help you understand everything and will help you convert the more old-fashioned language into more contemporary English. So let's begin. Right now, if you feel you're getting lost at any point, don't worry, just keep listening and I will clarify things for you regularly. As you listen, can you solve the mystery? Okay, can you solve the mystery? Listen to the evidence and descriptions and try to work out who committed the crime, why, and crucially, how they did it. And then you can just marvel at the way Sherlock Holmes almost perfectly solves this case. So let's go back in time to London at the end of the 19th century for a Gothic mystery. Now, remember, just a reminder for those of you who maybe aren't so familiar with Sherlock Holmes. So Sherlock Holmes is a professional private detective with a particular set of skills. He's a very, very observant man. He notices everything, and he's able to use logic and deductive reasoning to understand things deeply and solve problems which other people can't. When we talk about deductive reasoning, deducing things, and being deductive, it means basically looking at evidence, seeing things, and then making conclusions based on what you can see. So those conclusions that you make based on the things you can see, these are called deductions, and these help you. These deductions are when you work out something that you can't actually see, something that you don't know, but you work it out from the evidence. For example, I don't know what it would be. Like, for example, I don't know. Just thinking of an example. So you come home from work and you go into your living room and you see that a newspaper has been completely ripped to pieces, that there's pieces of newspaper all over the living room. It's just been... This newspaper has been ripped to shreds, and you see your dog sitting in the middle of the room with bits of newspaper sticking out of its mouth and with a guilty look on its face. Now, obviously you don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to work out what has happened here, but nevertheless you could deduce that your dog basically has ripped this newspaper to pieces while you were not there. The dog was having a wonderful time playing with this newspaper and decided to rip it to shreds in your absence. So that's obviously, you know, you didn't see the dog doing it, but you could just see the evidence in front of you and you basically work out what has happened. That is a basic form of deductive reasoning, although what Sherlock Holmes does is a lot more sophisticated than that. You know, he notices all sorts of little clues and is able to put them together very brilliantly. This is one of the great things about Sherlock Holmes. So he lives at 221B Baker Street in London with his companion, Dr. John Watson. Watson accompanies Holmes on his investigations and writes accounts of what happens each time. These accounts of what have happened, these descriptions, are what we read in these short stories. So the story is narrated by Watson. Okay? All right then. So let's begin. The story is called The Adventure of the Speckled Band. This is actually a crucial detail, the speckled band. Now, a band has two meanings. One meaning of band is a group of people, like a group of musicians could be called a band, but really a group of people, maybe a group of soldiers or another group of people. Sometimes that could be referred to as a band. That's one meaning of the word band. Another meaning of the word band would be like a kind of a strip of fabric, like maybe a headband. You know, you see people when they do sports, like if, you know, people who play tennis sometimes would wear a headband around their head, and it absorbs sweat and stops the sweat dripping down into their eyes. That's a headband for tennis players, for example. But a band, yes, can be a strip of fabric like that. That's another meaning of the word band, and that double meaning does kind of come into the story a little bit. Speckled refers to a sort of pattern, let's say, like a design. Speckled would be a design which has lots of little spots on it, for example. Lots of little spots could be described as speckled. Like certain birds' eggs. Certain birds' eggs. Not chicken eggs. Chicken eggs are normally just white or kind of a tan brown, reddish brown colour. But some bird eggs are speckled. They've got little sort of speckled spots on them or something. So the speckled band, what does that mean? That's part of the mystery, really, what the speckled band actually is. And you'll find out as the story progresses. So, okay, it's time to start the story. These are the words of John Watson then. And here we go. On glancing over my notes of the 70-odd cases in which I have, during the last 8 years, studied the methods of my friend Sherlock Holmes, I find many tragic, some comic, a large number merely strange, but none commonplace. For, working as he did rather for the love of his art than for the acquirement of wealth, he refused to associate himself with any investigation which did not tend towards the unusual and even the fantastic. Of all these varied cases, however, I cannot recall any which presented more singular features than that which was associated with the well-known Surrey family of the Roylotts of Stoke Moran. The events in question occurred in the early days of my association with Holmes, when we were sharing rooms as bachelors in Baker Street. It is possible that I might have placed them upon record before, but a promise of secrecy was made at the time, from which I have only been freed during the last month by the untimely death of the lady to whom the pledge was given. It is perhaps as well that the facts should now come to light, for I have reasons to know that there are widespread rumours as to the death of Mr. Grimesby Roylott, which tend to make the matter even more terrible than the truth. Okay, so I'm actually going to pause here already. It's lovely, isn't it? Lovely writing. But let me just explain what we've had. So Watson is talking about when he is glancing over the notes of the 70-odd cases which he has during the last 8 years studied. So he's looking at all of his notes, and there are about 70 different cases which he has written down while studying the methods of Sherlock Holmes. And looking at all of these cases, he notices that many of them are tragic. Some of them are comic, meaning kind of funny. A large number are merely strange, just odd, just bizarre, strange. But none of them are commonplace. So commonplace meaning just usual, or the sort of thing that often happens. So they're all of them are unusual. So none of them are commonplace. Commonplace meaning usual or common. For, meaning because, working as he did rather for the love of his art. So the fact that Sherlock Holmes works for the love of the work, the love of his art in this case, because he does that, he tends to accept cases because they're interesting rather than because they pay well. And as a result, most of the cases that Sherlock Holmes works on are particularly interesting ones. He's attracted to the interesting, strange, bizarre, unusual cases. And yeah, of all of these cases, all of these 70 cases, Watson can't remember, he can't recall any which were more singular than this one. Singular meaning basically unique. So this one is really unique compared to the other ones. And this is a story associated with the well-known Surrey family of the Roylotts of Stoke Moran. So this story features a family based in Surrey called the Roylotts of this town called Stoke Moran. It's a made-up town. It doesn't actually exist. The Roylotts would be a sort of a noble family from this part of southeast England. The events in question occurred in the early days of my association with Holmes. So Watson is saying that this story is from the early days, and he hasn't published it before because he had to keep it secret. But the woman who he promised this oath of secrecy to, she has died, and so now he's able to publish the story. And also, he thinks it's important because there were lots of rumours about one of the main characters in the story, rumours which are kind of strange and not true, and so he thinks it's time to publish this story in order to actually reveal, finally, the truth of what happened to this man, Dr. Grimesby Roylott. Okay, let's continue. So, it was early in April in the year 83 that I woke one morning to find Sherlock Holmes standing, fully dressed, by the side of my bed. He was a late riser, as a rule, and as the clock on the mantelpiece showed me that it was only 7:15, I blinked up at him in some surprise, and perhaps just a little resentment, for I was myself regular in my habits. "Very sorry to knock you up, Watson," said he, "but it's the common lot this morning. Mrs. Hudson has been knocked up. She retorted upon me, and I on you." "What is it then? A fire?" "No, a client. It seems that a young lady has arrived in a considerable state of excitement, who insists upon seeing me. She is waiting now in the sitting room. Now, when young ladies wander about the metropolis at this hour of the morning, and knock sleepy people up out of their beds, I presume that it is something very pressing, which they have to communicate. Should it prove to be an interesting case, you would, I am sure, wish to follow it from the outset. I thought at any rate that I should call you and give you the chance." "My dear fellow, I would not miss it for anything," said Watson. I had no keener pleasure than in following Holmes in his professional investigations, and in admiring the rapid deductions, as swift as intuitions, and yet always founded on a logical basis with which he unravelled the problems which were submitted to him. So let's pause again and just clarify all that. So this starts basically with, it's early April, so the beginning of spring. One morning early, Watson wakes up and Sherlock Holmes is standing, fully dressed, by the side of his bed. Okay, and Watson's like thinking, what's going on? Because Watson is a late riser, someone who gets up late as a rule. Generally speaking, he's a late riser. He tends to get up late. And the clock on the mantelpiece, he looked at the clock and it showed that it was only 7:15 in the morning. So Watson was a bit surprised and maybe a bit annoyed, like, what is it, Holmes? He's annoyed because he was regular in his habits, meaning that he, normally liked to get up at the same time every day, no doubt later than this early time. Watson says, "I'm very sorry to wake you up." He says, very sorry to knock you up," which is a phrasal verb that we don't really use anymore. We would say wake you up. "Sorry to wake you up, Watson." Right? In the story, it's knock you up. We do have a phrasal verb, which is to knock someone up. But these days, it's a kind of very informal phrase, which means to make someone pregnant, to get someone pregnant. It's a slightly rude sounding phrase. It's not a very polite sounding phrasal verb. To be knocked up means to be pregnant. But that's not how it's used here. So here it's, I mean, thankfully, I don't think Sherlock Holmes made Watson pregnant. If that's the case, then there's like a whole other subtext which I wasn't aware of. Although, well, anyway. So, very sorry to wake you up, Watson, but it's the common lot this morning. So, Mrs. Hudson got woken up by the visitor. Mrs. Hudson woke up Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes has gone to Watson to wake him up. And he reveals that it's a client, and it looks like it's an interesting case. So he wanted to know if Watson was interested in, finding out the story. And Watson says, yes, absolutely, of course. I love following Sherlock Holmes's cases and so on. Right, let's move on. So again, remember, my focus here is on getting through the story. There are lots and lots of details, lots of pieces of vocab, which I could be dealing with in a more detailed way, but I'm choosing not to. And I'm just hoping that my general summaries are helping you follow the story. If you want to look up specific words, be my guest. You can find the PDF. You can check the words and phrases in a decent online dictionary, collinsdictionary.com, Oxford Learners Dictionaries, dictionaries.cambridge.org, and so on and so forth. Okay, but we're focusing on story here first and foremost. So, let's continue. I rapidly threw on my clothes and was ready in a few minutes to accompany my friend down to the sitting room. A lady dressed in black and heavily veiled, who'd been sitting in the window, rose as we entered. So she's heavily veiled, which means she's got a veil over her face. This is something that covers... Women used to wear veils. Of course, some women still do, right? It's associated sort of with some religious communities, right, as we know. But this kind of veil, it's kind of like made of a fabric that you can see through it, but when it's worn close over someone's face, you can't really see their face. In weddings, in like traditional wedding dresses might have a veil as well that the woman would wear while she's walking down the aisle. This would be a white veil. The veil gets lifted during the wedding ceremony, right? So that's a veil. So this lady is dressed in black and she's got a veil over her face. She's been sitting in the window. This woman rose as we entered. She stood up as we entered the room. "Good morning, madam," said Holmes cheerily. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my intimate friend and associate, Dr. Watson, before whom you can speak as freely as before myself." "Ha! I'm glad to see that Mrs. Hudson has had the good sense to light the fire. Pray draw up to it, and I shall order you a cup of hot coffee, for I observe that you are shivering." "It is not cold which makes me shiver," said the woman in a low voice, changing her seat as requested. "Well, what then?" "It is fear, Mr. Holmes. It is terror." She raised her veil as she spoke, and we could see that she was indeed in a pitiable state of agitation, her face all drawn and grey, with restless, frightened eyes, like those of some hunted animal. Her features and figure were those of a woman of 30, but her hair was shot with premature grey, and her expression was weary and haggard. Okay, so the woman wearing the veil. Holmes is very cheerful, but she, in contrast, is not, and she seems to be in a very upset state. She's shivering, which means shaking when your body shakes. Normally we shiver when we are cold, but this woman is shivering because she's terrified. Okay, she removes the veil, she raises the veil, and we can see that she is in a pitiable state of agitation. Pitiable meaning a very sorry state, a very bad condition, probably bad mental state where she's in a lot of fear. She has frightened eyes like some kind of hunted animal. She looks basically like a woman of 30, but her hair is going grey, and the expression on her face looks weary, like very tired, and haggard, like exhausted. You know, the way you might look if you've just been through some horrible, horrible experience. You would look tired, but you'd look haggard, like kind of very tired and extremely kind of extremely sort of stressed and badly affected by what's been happening. Let's continue. Sherlock Holmes ran her over with one of his quick, all-comprehensive glances. So he kind of gave her a quick look. "You must not fear," said he, soothingly, bending forward and patting her forearm. "We shall soon set matters right. I have no doubt. You have come in by train this morning, I see." "You know me, then?" "No, but I observed the second half of a return ticket in the palm of your left glove. You must have started early, and yet you had a good drive in a dog-cart along heavy roads before you reached the station." The lady gave a violent start and stared in bewilderment at my companion. She can't believe what he's just said. "There is no mystery, my dear madam," said he, smiling. "The left arm of your jacket is spattered with mud in no less than 7 places. The marks are perfectly fresh. There is no vehicle save a dog-cart, which throws up mud in that way, and then only when you sit on the left-hand side of the driver." "Whatever your reasons may be, you are perfectly correct," said she. "I started from home before 6, reached Leatherhead at 20 past, and came in by the first train to Waterloo. Sir, I can stand this strain no longer. I shall go mad if it continues. I have no one to turn to, none, save only one, who cares for me, and he, poor fellow, can be of little aid." Okay, so Holmes does a bit of his deductive reasoning. He works out that she's come in early this morning on a train, and that she also had a trip on a dog cart. That's a small wooden cart that would have been pulled by a horse through the countryside. She's surprised that he knows all these things, and he says it's, pretty easy. Look, you've got half a train ticket in your hand, and you've been splattered by mud on your left arm, I think it is. The only way that you could be spattered with mud in that way would be if you had been travelling in a dog cart, one of these small carts. The dog carts are the only sorts of vehicle that throw up mud in that way. So anyway, he's already worked out, like a lot about the journey that she's had that morning. And she confirms it by telling him that she came from Leatherhead, which is a town, outside London. Let's continue. "I have heard of you, Mr. Holmes. I have heard of you from Mrs. Farintosh, whom you helped in the hour of her sore need. It was from her that I had your address." "Oh, sir, do you not think that you could help me too, and at least throw a little light through the dense darkness which surrounds me? At present it is out of my power to reward you for your services, but in a month or 6 weeks I shall be married, with the control of my own income, and then at least you shall not find me ungrateful." Holmes turned to his desk and, unlocking it, drew out a small case-book, which he consulted. "Farintosh," said he. "Ah, yes, I recall the case. It was concerned with an opal tiara. I think it was before your time, Watson." "I can only say, madam, that I shall be happy to devote the same care to your case as I did to that of your friend. As to reward, my profession is its own reward. But you are at liberty to defray whatever expenses I may be put to at the time which suits you best." So this woman, she knows about Holmes from a friend of hers who also used Holmes's services to solve some other case which involved an opal tiara, some sort of, jewellery that you wear on the head, that women wear on their head. Right? Sort of thing a princess would wear, or someone in a ball gown would wear, like a little, it's kind of like a little crown that just goes around the front, and girls might wear one on their head. And they might have jewels in them. So I suppose Holmes maybe helped to find this stolen piece of jewellery or something for the woman's friend, Mrs. Farintosh. And the woman who's visited Holmes says that she's unable to... What is it? She's unable to pay? she says, it's out of my power to reward you for your services, but in a month or 6 weeks I shall be married. So, and then I'll have the control of my own income. So she says she can't pay him now, but when she's married, later on, she'll have control of her own money. She'll be able to do it then. And Holmes says, don't worry, the work itself is the payment that I look for, but when it's convenient for you, you can just pay my expenses. That's probably the money that he's going to spend if there's any travelling involved or any other money which Holmes spends while covering this case. Okay, let's continue. Holmes says, and now I beg that you will lay before us everything that may help us in forming an opinion upon the matter. So this is the bit where the client explains what's happened. So these are important parts of the story. This is the backstory. Alas, replied our visitor, the very horror of my situation lies in the fact that my fears are so vague and my suspicions depend so entirely upon small points, which might seem trivial to another, that even he to whom of all others I have a right to look for help and advice looks upon all that I tell him about it as the fancies of a nervous woman. So basically she's saying all the information she has is very vague. She doesn't understand the situation. It's all based on very small pieces of information that she doesn't really understand. And when she talks to this other person, who I'm assuming is her fiancé, the man that she's engaged to be married to, when she tries to talk to him about it, he doesn't take it seriously, which is a pity. He does not say so, but I can read it from his soothing answers and averted eyes. But I have heard, Mr. Holmes, that you can see deeply into the manifold wickedness of the human heart. You may advise me how to walk amid the dangers which encompass me. I am all attention, madam. Okay, let's continue. My name is Helen Stoner, and I'm living with my stepfather, who is the last survivor of one of the oldest Saxon families in England, the Roylotts of Stoke Moran, on the western border of Surrey. Holmes nodded his head. The name is familiar to me, he said. The family was at one time among the richest in England, and the estates extended over the borders into Berkshire in the north and Hampshire in the west. In the last century, however, 4 successive heirs were of a dissolute and wasteful disposition, and the family ruin was eventually completed by a gambler in the days of the Regency. Nothing was left save a few acres of ground and the 200-year-old house, which is itself crushed under a heavy mortgage. The last squire dragged out his existence there, living the horrible life of an aristocratic pauper. But his only son, my stepfather, seeing that he must adapt himself to the new conditions, obtained an advance from a relative, which enabled him to take a medical degree and went out to Calcutta, where, by his professional skill and his force of character, he established a large practice. So I think I need to stop and explain here. So basically, this woman, Helen Stoner, she is part of this family. In fact, it's her stepfather's family. Stepfather, that means her mother married. So it's not her natural biological father, but it's her mother's husband, right? So let's say the mother had Helen with another man. She was probably previously married to him. Something may have happened to him, and then she ended up getting married to this other person, and this is Helen's stepfather. And Helen's stepfather is the head of this family. In fact, he's the only surviving member of this old family. Is it the oldest Saxon family in England? The Saxons were a tribe of people who travelled to England from, is it like Denmark, Germany, right? Okay, and settled in England. So this is like, this is a very, very old aristocratic family. Okay, the Roylotts of Stoke Moran on the western border of Surrey, down in southeast England. So her stepfather, yes, is the last remaining member of this family line. Okay. Helen describes how the family used to be rich, but over 4 successive generations, the wealth of the family has been lost. I guess by the heads of each generation, the main male heir of each generation, not managing the estate very well. The estate that refers to the land and all of the money that the family owns. And as a result, the state of this family has gone really bad. All the money's gone. Previously, the family owned a lot of land, which stretched into other counties. All that land is gone. And the only thing that the family has left is 200 acres of land. So that's kind of like a very big garden. And the house itself, one of these old stately homes. This is a bit like Downton Abbey. You can think of it like that. But Downton Abbey in really bad condition, where the head of the house, Lord Crawley, in this case, his name is, what's his name again? Roylott, is, you know, he's the only one left. And the house is in disrepair. There's also a heavy mortgage on the house. A mortgage, that means basically a bank loan. So debt. Okay, so the house is crushed under a mortgage, which means that that a lot of money was borrowed against the house. So there's no money, there's no cash. The house, the family is poor, even though they're an aristocratic family. They're very poor, and it's really the male heir of this that's in charge of this. His name is Roylott, and Roylott's father lived the life of an aristocratic pauper. A pauper is someone who's poor with no money. But then Roylott, the stepfather, decided that he had to adapt himself to these conditions, and he borrowed money from a member of the family and used it to get a medical degree. He trained to become a doctor, and he went to Calcutta in India. He travelled to India. This is during the time of the British occupation of India. So he went and lived in India and established a medical practice there. So he worked in India as a doctor. And with his professional skill and force of character, he set up a medical practice in India. Right, so let's continue. In a fit of anger is the next line. In a fit of anger, however, caused by some robberies which had been perpetrated in the house, he beat his native butler to death and narrowly escaped a capital sentence. As it was, he suffered a long term of imprisonment and afterwards returned to England a morose and disappointed man. So while he was in India, Roylott, the stepfather, in a moment of anger, because he's a very angry man, in a moment of anger which was caused by some robberies in the house, so some people have been stealing things from his house, in a fit of anger, he attacked his Indian butler. A butler is a person who sort of serves the head of the house. You can imagine him in a black suit, holding a tray, you know, and visiting the man of the house and saying, you know, "Would you like me to serve tea, sir?" You know, that's the sort of thing a butler does, the head of the servants in the house. So the stepfather attacked his Indian butler and beat him to death and killed him over this problem with the robberies in the house, which is, you know, terrible. This stepfather seems like an absolute monster. He narrowly escaped a capital sentence. A capital sentence would be the death sentence. So he only just avoided being killed for this murder as a punishment. But he did suffer a long term of imprisonment. So he spent a long time in jail, in prison. And after that, he returned to England, and he was a morose and disappointed man. Morose means in a bad mood, very moody, very angry, unhappy and disappointed because of all of these experiences. Let's continue. When Dr. Roylott, and this is still Helen, the stepdaughter, describing the story. When Dr. Roylott was in India, he married my mother, Mrs. Stoner, the young widow of Major General Stoner of the Bengal Artillery. My sister Julia and I were twins. and we were only 2 years old at the time of my mother's remarriage. She had a considerable sum of money, not less than £1,000 a year, and this she bequeathed to Dr. Roylott entirely while we resided with him, with a provision that a certain annual sum should be allowed to each of us in the event of our marriage. All right. So Helen, the one telling the story, her mum was married to this military man, Major General Stoner. I guess something happened to him and he died, and she ended up remarrying, and she married Dr. Roylott. Okay? And this is when Helen and her twin sister, so there's a twin sister, Julia. Helen and Julia were 2 years old when the marriage happened. And the girls had a lot of money. They had £1,000 a year, which was a lot of money in those days. No, sorry, the mum, the girl's mum, had a lot of money, and she bequeathed it to Dr. Roylott. She promised to give it all to him while they lived with him. Part of the arrangement of her giving him the money was that some of that money would be given to each of the girls if they got married. Okay, so she gave him all the money, Dr. Roylott all the money, but if one of the two daughters gets married, they would have the right to take a lot of that money away. Okay? All right, let's continue. Shortly after our return to England, my mother died. She was killed 8 years ago in a railway accident near Crewe. Dr. Roylott then abandoned his attempts to establish himself in practice in London and took us to live with him in the old ancestral house at Stoke Moran. The money which my mother had left was enough for all our wants, and there seemed to be no obstacle to our happiness. But a terrible change came over our stepfather about this time. Instead of making friends and exchanging visits with our neighbours, who had at first enjoyed to see a Roylott of Stoke Moran back in the old family seat, he shut himself up in his house and seldom came out save to indulge in ferocious quarrels with whoever might cross his path. Okay, so they moved to England. The mother unfortunately died in a railway accident, and at that point Dr. Roylott and the two daughters lived together, and Dr. Roylott decided he would give up trying to establish himself, and he just lived in the house with the girls, and they all lived on the money that the girls had inherited from their mother. So at this point, Dr. Roylott and the two girls are living on the inheritance from the mother at this point. And something changed in him, in the doctor as well. He stayed in the house all the time. He shut himself up. He seldom came out, so he rarely came out, save to indulge in quarrels. So the only time he came out was to have big arguments, very angry arguments with anyone, with whoever might cross his path, whoever he met. So the only reason he'd go outside would be to get involved in some angry, aggressive argument with someone. So he's a very angry and violent man. Violence of temper approaching to mania has been hereditary in the men of the family, and in my stepfather's case it had, I believe, been intensified by his long residence in the tropics. A series of disgraceful brawls took place, 2 of which ended in the police court, until at last he became the terror of the village, and the folks would fly at his approach, for he is a man of immense strength and absolutely uncontrollable in his anger. So the guy sounds like he's totally out of control. He's got major anger management issues, and he's been involved in several brawls, several physical fights with other people, which ended in him going to the police station. And he finally has become the terror of the village. Everyone in the village is afraid of him. People would escape when he approached. He's a man of immense strength. He's completely out of control and totally angry all the time. All right, he's a nightmare, but this is certainly a very suspicious character. Anyway, let's continue. Last week, he hurled the local blacksmith over a parapet into a stream, and it was only by paying over all the money which I could gather together that I was able to avert another public exposure. So he actually threw a man, the blacksmith, guy who works with metal, he threw this man over a balcony or over a wall into a stream, like into a river. He threw a man into a river, and and Helen had to pay a lot of money to try and avoid this becoming a big public exposure. He had no friends at all, save the wandering gypsies, and he would give these vagabonds leave to encamp upon a few acres of bramble-covered land, which represent the family estate, and would accept in return the hospitality of their tents, wandering away with them sometimes for weeks on end. So, Dr. Roylott has no friends except for a group of gypsies. Gypsies are travelling people, right? It's like a whole culture. We have gypsies in the UK. And yeah, these are people who travel. They don't actually have any fixed place to live, but they move from place to place. And gypsies are often sort of people often have very negative opinions of gypsies, you know, because of the way that they live, and they're often considered to be trouble, and people don't trust them. That's the kind of stereotype. That's the way that gypsies are often treated, and I suppose at this time in particular it would have been certainly the case that gypsies are often looked upon with suspicion because people maybe are threatened by them because they, you know, their lifestyle, and they are concerned that they might commit crime. They kind of live outside of society in a way, and that makes them kind of a little bit of a threat, it seems, to most people's ordinary way of life. And they might be associated with like crime and stuff. You might have seen the film Snatch. Brad Pitt. It's a Guy Ritchie film with Brad Pitt and Jason Statham in it. In that film, Brad Pitt plays an Irish gypsy. And if you've seen the film, you can see the way that gypsies are represented, the travelling lifestyle, the kind of relationship they have with the rest of society. Anyway, so Dr. Roylott is only friends with a group of travelling gypsies. He lets them stay on his land. And in fact, often they return the favour by welcoming him in to their community. And he often goes and travels away with them for several weeks at a time. So he's kind of like only friends with these gypsies who are often living on his land. Continuing, he also has a passion for Indian animals, which are sent over to him by a correspondent, and he has at this moment a cheetah and a baboon, which wander freely over his grounds and are feared by the villagers almost as much as their master. Okay, so as Dr. Roylott also owns some Indian animals, a cheetah and a baboon. Now, cheetahs used to be native to India. We associate them normally with like the plains of Africa, right? Cheetahs are big cats, the fastest animal on the land. That's a cheetah, very fast, big cat. I think they used to be in India as well. Not sure these days. And so he's got a cheetah. He's also got a baboon. A baboon is a type of monkey, right? Although, as far as I'm aware, they don't have baboons in India. I think baboons are... baboons can be found elsewhere. Anyway, it's a type of monkey. And he lets these animals just wander freely on his grounds, meaning on the land around the house. And everyone in the village is terrified of these animals, as you would understand, as you could imagine. They're almost as terrified of the animals as they are of Dr. Roylott himself, who is even more of a monster. Not that these animals are monsters, but I'm sure that they could be very scary, right? If you live in an English village and there's a cheetah running around, or a baboon in the tree, and you know, baboons can be very frightening. They're very strong and very wild. Now, let's continue. You can imagine from what I say that my poor sister Julia and I had no great pleasure in our lives. No servant would stay with us, and for a long time we did all the work of the house. She was but 30 at the time of her death, and yet her hair had already begun to whiten, even as mine has. Your sister is dead, then? She died just 2 years ago, and it's of her death that I wish to speak to you. You can understand that, living the life which I have described, we were little likely to see anyone of our own age and position. We had, however, an aunt, my mother's maiden sister, Miss Honoria Westphale, who lives near Harrow, and we were occasionally allowed to pay short visits to this lady's house. Julia went there at Christmas 2 years ago and met there a half-pay major of Marines, to whom she became engaged. My stepfather learned of the engagement when my sister returned and offered no objection to the marriage. But within a fortnight of the day which had been fixed for the wedding, the terrible event occurred which has deprived me of my only companion. All right, so Helen and her sister lived a miserable life, very fearful life. She described how Julia, even though she's was only in her 30s, her hair had already begun to go white, just like Helen's has. Julia died 2 years ago. Before she died, she went to visit an aunt in another part of the country at Christmas or something. And when she was there, she met a man, this major, again another army man, and she became engaged to marry him. The stepfather, Dr. Roylott, did not oppose it, so he accepted it. But within a fortnight of the day which had been fixed for the wedding, so about 2 weeks before the wedding day, this terrible event happened, which led to Julia being killed, depriving Helen of her only companion. Let's continue. Sherlock Holmes had been leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed and his head sunk in a cushion, but he half opened his lids now and glanced across at his visitor. "Pray, be precise as to the details," said he. "It is easy for me to be so, for every event of that dreadful time is seared into my memory. The manor house is, as I have already said, very old, and only one wing is now inhabited. The bedrooms in this wing are on the ground floor, the sitting rooms being in the central block of the buildings. Of these bedrooms, the first is Dr. Roylott's, the second my sister's, and the third my own. There is no communication between them, but they all open out into the same corridor. Do I make myself plain?" "Perfectly so," said Holmes. "The windows of the 3 rooms open out upon the lawn. That fatal night Dr. Roylott had gone to his room early, though we knew that he had not retired to rest, for my sister was troubled by the smell of the strong Indian cigars which it was his custom to smoke. She left her room, therefore, and came into mine, where she sat for some time, chatting about her approaching wedding. At 11 o'clock she rose to leave me, but she paused at the door and looked back. 'Tell me, Helen,' she said, 'have you ever heard anyone whistle in the dead of the night?'" Like whistle. That's whistle. "Have you ever heard anyone whistle in the dead of the night?" "Never," said I. "I suppose that you could not possibly whistle yourself in your sleep?" "Well, certainly not. But why?" "Because during the last few nights I have always, about 3 in the morning, heard a low, clear whistle. I am a light sleeper, and it has awakened me. I cannot tell where it came from, perhaps from the next room, perhaps from the lawn. I thought that I would ask you whether you'd heard it." "No, I have not. It must be those wretched gypsies in the plantation." "Very likely. And yet, if it were on the lawn, I wonder that you did not hear it also." "Ah, but I sleep more heavily than you." "Well, it is of no great consequence at any rate." She smiled back at me, closed my door, and a few minutes later I heard her key turn in the lock. "Indeed," said Holmes. "Was it your custom always to lock yourselves in at night?" "Always." "And why?" "I think that I mentioned to you that the doctor kept a cheetah and a baboon. We had no feeling of security unless our doors were locked." "Quite so. Pray, proceed with your statement. Right, so I need to go back and just explain some of this stuff. So, Helen describes the details. She describes the house. It's very old. These old houses are separated into wings, just like the White House in Washington, D.C. in the USA. You've got the West Wing and the different wings of the house, different sections. So this old house, I guess there's the central part of the house, the main centre of the house. And then I think there are two wings on this house. One of the, as we'll discover later in the story, one of those wings is in bad condition and no one uses it. The other wing of the house, though, is where the bedrooms are. And they're on the ground floor, and there are 3 bedrooms. So from the central part of the house, the first bedroom is Dr. Roylett's bedroom. The second one was Julia's bedroom. And the third one is Helen's bedroom. She said there's no communication between the rooms. So there are no doors that lead from one room to the next. Okay. But the rooms all do open out onto one shared corridor. So there's one corridor, the rooms all open out onto that corridor, but other than those doors, there are no doors that communicate the 3 rooms together. And on the other side, there are those rooms have windows, and there's the lawn, the grass, the garden. Okay, so you can imagine one of those rooms, any one of those rooms would have a door that leads into the corridor. And then on the other side of the room would be a window out onto the grass, onto the garden, right? And yeah, Dr. Roylett's room, then Julia's room, then Helen's room, right? Okay. Okay, the windows open out onto the lawn. Now, one night, the night that Julia died, they knew that Dr. Roylett had gone to his room, but he was still awake because Julia could smell the smell of him smoking in his room. She didn't like the smell, so she came and visited Helen in the next room, and they sat and talked until about 11 p.m. And just before Julia left, she turned to Helen and said something kind of strange. She said, "Have you ever heard a whistling sound in the night, in the middle of the night?" Which is a bit creepy. And Helen says, "No, I've never heard that." And Julia's saying, "I don't know where it comes from. It could come from the next room," meaning Dr. Roylett's room, or it could come from the garden, the lawn. But if it came from the garden, then I would imagine that Helen, you would hear it too. But Helen sleeps more deeply than Julia, so maybe she wouldn't. But anyway, Julia's kind of thinking, what is this mysterious whistling sound that I've been hearing in the middle of the night? And why doesn't Helen also hear the sound? Where's that sound coming from? It's a bit of a mysterious thing. And they assume that it's the gypsies that are on the plantation somewhere, that maybe one of the gypsies is wandering around whistling or something like that. But it's a bit creepy. Yeah, and when Julia went back to her room, she locked Helen's door and locked her own door. And the reason they used to lock the doors was because of these wild animals that were roaming around, and they felt a lot more secure with the doors locked. But that's an important detail. Julia's door was locked from the inside. So we continue. "I could not sleep that night. A vague feeling of impending misfortune impressed me. My sister and I, you will recollect, were twins, and you know how subtle are the links which bind 2 souls which are so closely allied." So they're twins, they feel very close. She knows how, twins are often very, very close. And Helen couldn't sleep that night. She had this feeling that something bad was going to happen. A feeling of impending misfortune. A feeling of bad luck that was coming. It was a wild night. The wind was howling outside. And the rain was beating and splashing against the windows. Suddenly, amid all the hubbub of the gale, in the middle of this loud noise of this storm outside, there burst forth the wild scream of a terrified woman. I knew that it was my sister's voice. So in the middle of this storm, she suddenly hears this incredible scream. Ah! I sprang from my bed, wrapped a shawl around me, and rushed into the corridor. As I opened my door, I seemed to hear a low whistle, such as my sister described, and a few moments later a clanging sound. Clang! As if a mass of metal had fallen. As I ran down the passage, my sister's door was unlocked and revolved slowly upon its hinges. So she's run out into the corridor in order to find out what the scream was and to check on her sister. And she hears that strange whistle. She also hears the sound of something metal, as if something metal, heavy metal, has fallen or something. She goes into the passage. Her sister's door is unlocked and it swings open slowly upon its hinges. The door swings open, and Helen continues, I stared at it, horror-stricken, like that, not knowing what was about to issue from it. So she stared at the doorway. She didn't know what was going to come out. By the light of the corridor lamp, I saw my sister appear at the opening, her face blanched with terror, her hands groping for help, her whole figure swayed to and fro like that of a drunkard. So her sister emerged in the doorway. Her face is white with terror. Her hands are trying to grab for something to help her. Her whole body is swaying to and fro, swaying from side to side like as if she's totally drunk. I ran to her and threw my arms around her, but at that moment her knees seemed to give way and she fell to the ground. She writhed as one who is in terrible pain, and her limbs were dreadfully convulsed. At first I thought that she had not recognised me, but as I bent over her, she suddenly shrieked out in a voice which I shall never forget. "Oh my God, Helen! It was the band! The Speckled band!" So Helen runs to her sister, grabs her in her arms, and at that moment Julia's legs give way. She falls to the ground and writhes like she's in terrible pain. Her body is twisting and her limbs were dreadfully convulsed, so she's twisting and shaking uncontrollably. And suddenly she screams in a horrible voice. She screams, "Oh my God, Helen, it was the band, the Speckled band." Helen continues, "There was something else which she would fain have said, and she stabbed with her finger into the air in the direction of the doctor's room, but a fresh convulsion seized her and choked her words." So Julia wanted to say something else, but she couldn't manage to do it. She just managed to point up in the air towards the doctor's room. And then suddenly she couldn't speak. "I rushed out, calling loudly for my stepfather, and I met him hastening from his room in his dressing gown." So she saw him rushing from his room in his dressing gown. "When he reached my sister's side, she was unconscious, and though he poured brandy down her throat and sent for medical aid from the village, all efforts were in vain, for she slowly sank and died without having recovered her consciousness. Such was the dreadful end of my beloved sister." So she called for the stepfather. He came rushing out. He tried to revive her. He poured brandy down her throat, which of course was the solution to all problems in Victorian England. Just give, what's the matter? Just give them brandy. It's like the perfect medicine to solve all problems. But even brandy didn't help. Brandy is a form of strong alcoholic drink. So despite all the efforts to help her, she lost consciousness. She never recovered consciousness and she died. It's sad. "One moment," said Holmes. "Are you sure about this whistle and metallic sound? Could you swear to it?" Are you absolutely certain? Would you promise that you'd heard this? "That was what the county coroner asked me at the inquiry. It is my strong impression that I heard it, and yet, among the crash of the gale and the creaking of an old house, I may possibly have been deceived. Was your sister dressed? No, she was in her nightdress. In her right hand was found the charred stump of a match, and in her left a matchbox, showing that she had struck a light and looked about her when the alarm took place. That is important. And what conclusions did the coroner come to? He investigated the case with great care, for Dr. Roylett's conduct had long been notorious in the county, but he was unable to find any satisfactory cause of death. Okay, so Julia was not dressed. She was still in her nightdress, right, that she slept in. In her right hand was the charred remains of a match and a matchbox in her other hand. So she struck a match to get light in the room and looked about her when this had happened. Right? Okay, the coroner, that's the person who examines the body, investigated, maybe the first person to investigate the case. He said he couldn't find any satisfactory cause of death, so the coroner didn't know what caused Julia's death. Helen says, my evidence showed that the door had been fastened upon the inner side, so it had been locked from the inside, and the windows were blocked by old-fashioned shutters with broad iron bars, which were secured every night. The walls were carefully sounded and were shown to be quite solid all round, and the flooring was also thoroughly examined with the same result. So Helen is saying that, you know, when the room was examined, they noticed it had been locked from the inside. The windows were blocked by old-fashioned shutters. These are things that cover the windows, with broad iron bars, so strong metal bars that covered the windows. And these things were secured, meaning closed every single night. The walls were carefully sounded, so the walls were checked like that and were found to be solid everywhere. And the flooring was also examined with the same result. So there are no secret doors, no secret trap doors or anything. The chimney, this is where you would have a fire. The smoke goes up the chimney. So the fireplace and the chimney is wide, but it's barred up by 4 large staples. This means there are big metal bars in the chimney, which means that no one could get down. No one could climb through the chimney. It is certain, therefore, that my sister was quite alone when she met her end. Besides, there were no marks of any violence upon her. Okay, so this is one of those locked room mysteries, a bit like the one with my mobile phone recently, where I came back into the room that had been locked and discovered my phone had just suddenly been smashed to pieces by unknown forces, although that's a little easier to work out. There was basically the battery expanded and caused the phone to break, so not so much of a mystery. This one is a bit more curious, don't you think? What happened? How did she die? What's going on? So, Holmes continues. How about poison? The doctors examined her for it, but without success. What do you think that this unfortunate lady died of, then? It is my belief that she died of pure fear and nervous shock, though what it was that frightened her I cannot imagine. Were there gypsies in the plantation at the time? Yes, there are nearly always some there. Ah, and what did you gather from this allusion to a band, a speckled band? Sometimes I've thought that it was merely the wild talk of delirium. Sometimes that it may have referred to some band of people, perhaps to these very gypsies in the plantation. I do not know whether the spotted handkerchiefs, which so many of them wear over their heads, might have suggested the strange adjective which she used. So Holmes is curious about the gypsies, and apparently there are always gypsies in the plantation. And what about this allusion, this reference to the speckled band? And Helen doesn't really know. She's wondering if it's maybe a reference to the handkerchiefs that these gypsies often wear over their heads. They often wear handkerchiefs with with spots on them. Might be like red with white spots. She was wondering if it would be a reference to those handkerchiefs. They're speckled, kind of. She's not sure. Holmes shook his head like a man who is far from being satisfied. "These are very deep waters," he said. "Pray go on with your narrative." 2 years have passed since then, and my life has been until lately lonelier than ever. A month ago, however, a dear friend, whom I've known for many years, has done me the honour to ask my hand in marriage. His name is Armitage, Percy Armitage, the second son of Mr. Armitage of Crane Water, near Reading. My stepfather has offered no opposition to the match, and we are to be married in the course of the spring. 2 days ago some repairs were started in the west wing of the building, and my bedroom wall has been pierced, so that I have had to move into the chamber in which my sister died, and to sleep in the very bed in which she slept. Imagine then my thrill of terror when last night, as I lay awake, thinking over her terrible fate, I suddenly heard in the silence of the night the low whistle which had been the herald of her own death. I sprang up and lit the lamp, but nothing was to be seen in the room. I was too shaken to go to bed again, however, so I dressed, and as soon as it was daylight, I slipped down, got a dog-cart at the Crown Inn, which is opposite, and drove to Leatherhead, from whence I have come on this morning, with the one object of seeing you and asking your advice. So she says that there's been some repairs being done on the wing of the house, and that the wall of her room has been broken open or something. So she's had to move into Julia's old room, and she's had to sleep in Julia's old bed. Also, she's become engaged to be married. Right? She was proposed. An old friend of hers proposed to her, and she's going to be married to him. Dr. Roylott agreed to it. But then she had to move into Julia's room, and then late one night she heard the strange whistle. She was so disturbed by it. She turned on the lamp in the room, didn't see anything, but she was so disturbed that early that morning she dressed and took a cab to the station, and then came to London to visit Holmes and Watson. So we continue. "You have done wisely," said my friend. "But have you told me all?" "Yes, all." "Miss Roylott, you have not. You're screening your stepfather," meaning you're sort of protecting him, not telling Holmes everything, in order to sort of hide the stepfather. "Why? What do you mean?" For answer, Holmes pushed back the frill of black lace which fringed the hand that lay upon our visitor's knee. So she's wearing a sort of black laced glove, I guess, and Holmes pushes it back to reveal her skin. 5 little livid spots, the marks of 4 fingers and a thumb, were printed upon the white wrist. So there's marks of a hand on her wrist. "You have been cruelly used," said Holmes. The lady coloured deeply and covered her injured wrist. So Holmes notices this sort of injury, that clearly someone has grabbed her wrist very strongly and has left a mark of these fingers on her wrist. And when Holmes identified it, Helen went red. She coloured. She blushed and covered up her wrist. "He is a hard man," she said, "and perhaps he hardly knows his own strength." There was a long silence, during which Holmes leaned his chin upon his hands and stared into the crackling fire. "This is a very deep business," he said at last. "There are 1,000 details which I should desire to know before I decide upon our course of action. Yet we have not a moment to lose. If we were to come to Stoke Moran today, would it be possible for us to see over these rooms without the knowledge of your stepfather? As it happens, he spoke of coming into town today upon some important business. It is probable that he will be away all day, and that there would be nothing to disturb you. We have a housekeeper now, but she is old and foolish, and I could easily get her out of the way." "Excellent. You are not averse to this trip, Watson?" "Well, by no means." Then we shall both come. What are you going to do yourself?" "I have 1 or 2 things which I would wish to do now that I am in town. But I shall return by the 12 o'clock train so as to be there in time for your coming." "And you may expect us early in the afternoon. I have myself some small business matters to attend to. Will you not wait and breakfast?" "No, I must go. My heart is lightened already since I have confided my trouble to you. I shall look forward to seeing you again this afternoon." She dropped her thick black veil over her face and glided from the room. Okay, let's continue. "And what do you think of it all, Watson?" asked Sherlock Holmes, leaning back in his chair. "It seems to me to be a most dark and sinister business." "Dark enough and sinister enough. Yet if the lady is correct in saying that the flooring and walls are sound, and that the door, window and chimney are impassable, then her sister must have been undoubtedly alone when she met her mysterious end." So Holmes is saying, if Helen is correct in saying that the flooring and the walls are sound, meaning that they are solid and safe and that they don't contain any hidden doors, solid and safe and solid is what sound means in this case, and that the door, window and chimney are impassable, meaning if it's not possible to get through the door, the window or the chimney, then her sister must have undoubtedly been alone. So she, without doubt, she must have been alone when she died. What becomes then of these nocturnal whistles, and what of the very peculiar words of the dying woman? I cannot think. When you combine the ideas of whistles at night, the presence of a band of gypsies who are on intimate terms with this old doctor, the fact that we have every reason to believe that the doctor has an interest in preventing his stepdaughter's marriage, the dying allusion to a band, and finally the fact that Miss Helen Stoner heard a metallic clang, which might have been caused by one of those metal bars that secured the shutters falling back into its place, I think that there is good ground to think that the mystery may be cleared along those lines. So Holmes is saying that, he's trying to put 2 and 2 together. He's trying to make his deduction. All those things, what the woman said at night, in the middle of the night, about the speckled band, the whistles at night, the presence of the gypsies who are on intimate terms with the old doctor, the fact that we know that the doctor has a clear interest in preventing his stepdaughter's marriage, even though he agreed to it, but now it looks like he killed, the possible motive would be that he killed Julia because she was about to get married and he didn't want to lose all that money, right? And then Helen gets engaged and it seems that maybe he's trying to do a similar thing and trying to have her killed as well. But she managed to kind of avoid it this time. And he's also saying that the metallic clang, the metallic sound might have been caused by one of the metal bars on the window or one of the metal shutters. He thinks that, so Holmes is clearly thinking that maybe it's one of the gypsies who managed to come through the window. Maybe that's something to do with it. But what then did the gypsies do? I cannot imagine. I see many objections to any such theory, and so do I. So it's not a perfect theory. It is precisely for that reason that we are going to Stoke Moran this day. I want to see whether the objections are fatal, or if they may be explained away. But what in the name of the devil? Huh! But what in the name of the devil? So suddenly something has happened. The ejaculation, here we go again, another ejaculation in a Holmes and Watson story. Not to mention the fact that we know from this story that Watson is Holmes' intimate friend, as he described earlier. But anyway, it's not that kind of ejaculation. You can refer to episode, 832, if you want to know the other meaning of the word ejaculation. In this case, it's not the sexual form of ejaculation, but the more old-fashioned usage of the word, meaning when someone says something quickly, someone comes out with something very quickly. In this case, it's when Holmes said, "But what in the name of the devil?" Meaning a sort of, like, what the hell? The ejaculation had been drawn from my companion by the fact that our door had been suddenly dashed open, and that a huge man had framed himself in the aperture. So, bam, the door suddenly flew open, and a huge man was standing in the doorway. His costume was a peculiar mixture of the professional and of the agricultural, having a black top hat, a long frock coat, and a pair of high gaiters, I suppose those are boots, with a hunting crop swinging in his hand. Hunting crop is a kind of a leather-bound stick that you would be used to hit a horse to make it run faster. I think that's what it is. So tall was he that his hat actually brushed the crossbar of the doorway, and his width, seemed to span it across from side to side. So he's basically as tall as the door and as wide as the doorway as well. A large face, seared with 1,000 wrinkles, burned yellow with the sun, and marked with every evil passion, was turned from one to the other of us, while his deep-set, bile-shot eyes and his high, thin, fleshless nose gave him somewhat the resemblance to a fierce old bird of prey. Right, quite the descriptive paragraph. Large face, seared with 1,000 wrinkles, so it's cracked with millions of wrinkles. Or thousands of wrinkles. Burned yellow in the sun, so his face is all wrinkled and sunburned, no doubt from the years he spent in India, and marked with every evil passion. So, you know, his face is like this, tells a story of this very angry, kind of evil-looking face. It was turned from one of us to the other, so standing there looking at Holmes and looking at Watson like this. While his deep-set, bile-shot eyes, so his eyes are deep inside his head, and they're shot with bile, so they're kind of like yellowish eyes, and his high, thin, fleshless nose, so he has this sharp, thin, bony nose, gave him somewhat the resemblance to a fierce old bird of prey, so he looks like a hawk or a eagle or something like that. "Which of you is Holmes?" asked this apparition. My name, sir, but you have the advantage of me," said my companion quietly. "I am Dr. Grimesby Roylott of Stoke Moran." "Indeed, doctor," said Holmes blandly. "Pray take a seat." "I will do nothing of the kind. My stepdaughter has been here. I have traced her. What has she been saying to you?" "It is a little cold for the time of year," said Holmes. "What has she been saying to you?" screamed the old man furiously. "But I have heard that the crocuses promise well," continued my companion imperturbably. So, despite the fact that this man is screaming and shouting and demanding to know what Helen has been saying, Holmes is making small talk. "It is a little cold for the time of year." And then he says, "But I've heard that the crocuses promise well," meaning I have heard that these flowers are going to come up very nicely. So he's making kind of polite small talk while this man is so furiously demanding answers to the questions. "Ha! You put me off, do you?" said our new visitor, taking a step forward and shaking his hunting crop. "I know you, you scoundrel! I have heard of you before. You are Holmes the meddler." A meddler is someone who gets involved in other people's business. My friend smiled. "Holmes, the busybody!" A busybody is someone who's always busy, maybe getting involved again in things they shouldn't be getting involved in. Holmes's smile broadened. "Holmes, the Scotland Yard Jack in office!" Holmes chuckled heartily. "Your conversation is most entertaining," said he. "When you go out, close the door, for there's a decided draught." I love the way that Holmes reacts to him. Yeah. "When you go out, close the door, because there's a draught," which is like cold air coming in. "I will go when I have said my say. Don't you dare meddle with my affairs. I know that Miss Stoner has been here. I traced her. I am a dangerous man to fall foul of. See here." He stepped swiftly forward, seized the poker. This is a long iron, like metal stick, which is used to poke a fire, like a big heavy stick of metal that you would put into the fire to poke it. He seized the poker and bent it into a curve with his huge brown hands. "See that you keep yourself out of my grip," he snarled, and hurling the twisted poker into the fireplace, he strode out of the room. So he's threatening and intimidating Holmes, saying, "Keep out of my business," and he grabs this strong metal poker and bends it in his arms to show how strong he is, and then throws it back into the fireplace. Holmes says, "He seems a very amiable person," said Holmes, laughing. Amiable meaning friendly. "I'm not quite so bulky, but if he had remained, I might have shown him that my grip was not much more feeble than his own." As he spoke, he picked up the steel poker and, with a sudden effort, straightened it out again. So this is nice, because Holmes is saying, "Okay, I'm not as big as him, but I'm still just as strong as he is." If he'd stayed, he might have discovered that actually I'm not much weaker than him. And he takes the poker and bends it back into a straight position, which is very, very difficult to do. These metal pokers can be very, very, very hard to bend. Holmes can take care of himself. We find out about that in other stories, that he's actually an excellent boxer. There's a Guy Ritchie movie, talking about Guy Ritchie movies, and Snatch, the other film I mentioned. Of course, there are the Sherlock Holmes Guy Ritchie films, and you see Sherlock Holmes played by Robert Downey Jr. in those films, and in those ones he is a bare knuckle boxer. So you kind of they pushed that part of his character a little bit in those films to emphasize the action. But Holmes can box. He can use his fists, and people underestimate him, but he's an excellent boxer as well. "Fancy his having the insolence to confound me with the official detective force." So Holmes is almost offended by the fact that the guy confused him with the police, because Holmes is kind of Holmes doesn't really respect the police, so he's kind of offended that this guy just confused him for a member of the Scotland Yard police force. "Fancy his having the insolence to confound me with the official detective force. This incident gives zest to our investigation, however, and I only trust that our little friend will not suffer from her imprudence in allowing this brute to trace her." So he says this incident gives zest to our investigation. It makes it more exciting, but he hopes that Helen doesn't suffer from her lack of care in allowing the man to follow her. So he hopes that she's okay. "And now, Watson, we shall order breakfast, and afterwards I shall walk down to Doctors' Commons, where I hope to get some data which may help us in this matter." So they're going to have breakfast, and then Holmes is going to go and find out some information. It was nearly 1 o'clock when Sherlock Holmes returned from his excursion. He held in his hand a sheet of blue paper, scrawled over with notes and figures. "I have seen the will of the deceased wife," said he. "To determine its exact meaning, I have been obliged to work out the present prices of the investments with which it is concerned. The total income, which at the time of the wife's death was little short of £11,000, is now, through the fall in agricultural prices, not more than £750. Each daughter can claim an income of £250 in case of marriage. It is evident, therefore, that if both girls had married, this beauty would have had a mere pittance, while even one of them would cripple him to a very serious extent." So Holmes has worked out by looking at the finances that basically if even just one of these girls gets married, the guy is going to be left with virtually nothing, virtually no money. If they both get married, he's definitely going to be left with next to no money. So this is a clear motive. "My morning's work has not been wasted, since it has proved that he has the very strongest motives for standing in the way of anything of the sort. And now, Watson, this is too serious for dawdling, especially as the old man is aware that we are interesting ourselves in his affairs. So, if you are ready, we shall call a cab and drive to Waterloo." So he's basically saying, let's not waste time, let's get going. "I should be very much obliged if you would slip your revolver into your pocket, And Ely's number 2 is an excellent argument with gentlemen who can twist steel pokers into knots. That and a toothbrush are, I think, all that we need. So he's saying, oh, it would be a good idea if you brought your gun with you, because it's a great way to deal. It's a great argument to have when you're faced with a man who can twist a steel poker into knots. So bring your gun and a toothbrush. At Waterloo, we were fortunate in catching a train for Leatherhead, where we hired a trap at the station inn and drove for 4 or 5 miles through the lovely Surrey lanes. It was a perfect day, with a bright sun and a few fleecy clouds in the heavens. The trees and wayside hedges were just throwing out their first green shoots, and the air was full of the pleasant smell of the moist earth. To me, at least, there was a strange contrast between the sweet promise of the spring and this sinister quest upon which we were engaged. My companion sat in the front of the trap, his arms folded, his hat pulled down over his eyes, and his chin sunk upon his breast, buried in the deepest thought. Suddenly, however, he started, tapped me on the shoulder, and pointed over the meadows. "Look there," said he. A heavily timbered park stretched up in a gentle slope, thickening into a grove at the highest point. From amid the branches there jutted out the grey gables and high roof tree of a very old mansion. So they're riding through the countryside on this horse-driven cart, I guess, a taxi or something. Anyway, and Holmes has been thinking with his eyes closed, but he wakes up, opens his eyes and points towards the house, and you can see the hill rising up with some trees. There are more and more trees, and then from through the branches of the trees they can see the roof and parts of the house. "Stoke Moran?" said he. "Yes, sir, that be the house of Dr. Grimesby Roylott," remarked the driver. "There is some building going on there," said Holmes. "That is where we are going." "There's the village," said the driver, pointing to a cluster of roofs some distance to the left. "But if you want to get to the house, you'll find it shorter to get over this stile, and so by the footpath over the fields. There it is, where that lady's walking." So basically the driver is telling them how to get to the house. "And the lady, I fancy, is Miss Stoner," observed Holmes, shading his eyes. "Yes, I think we'd better do as you suggest." We got off, paid our fare, and the trap rattled back on its way to Leatherhead. "I thought it as well," said Holmes as we climbed the stile. A stile is a kind of a way to step over a fence in the countryside. It's like a part of the fence where you can climb over it. Okay, a stile. S-T-I-L-E. "I thought it as well that this fellow should think that we'd come here as architects, or on some definite business. It may stop his gossip." So Holmes decided to make the driver think that they were there as part of the building work, to stop him gossiping. Best that they try and keep a low profile. "Good afternoon, Miss Stoner. You see that we have been as good as our word." Our client of the morning had hurried forward to meet us with a face which spoke her joy. "I've been waiting so eagerly for you," she cried, shaking hands with us warmly. "All has turned out splendidly. Dr. Roylott has gone to town, and it's unlikely that he will be back before evening." "We have had the pleasure of making the doctor's acquaintance," said Holmes, and in a few words he sketched out what had occurred. Miss Stoner turned white to the lips as she listened. "Good heavens!" she cried. "He has followed me, then?" "So it appears." "He's so cunning that I never know when I'm safe from him. What will he say when he returns?" "He must guard himself, for he may find that there is someone more cunning than himself upon his track." Cunning means clever in a sort of slightly dark, kind of slightly evil way. Very, very clever. So the man is cunning, but Sherlock Holmes is saying he should be careful because someone is following him who is more cunning. Yeah, Holmes himself. "You must lock yourself up from him tonight. If he is violent, we shall take you away to your aunt's at Harrow. Now, We must make the best use of our time, so kindly take us at once to the rooms which we are to examine. The building was of grey, lichen-blotched stone, with a high central portion and two curving wings, like the claws of a crab, thrown out on each side. So as we described before, the central part of the house with its wings, the parts of the building on the side. In one of these wings, the windows were broken and blocked with wooden boards, while the roof was partly caved in, a picture of ruin. So this one wing is all ruined. The central portion was in little better repair, but the right-hand block, presumably the west wing, was comparatively modern, and the blinds in the windows, with the blue smoke curling up from the chimneys, showed that this was where the family resided. Some scaffolding had been erected against the end wall, and the stonework had been broken into. But there were no signs of any workmen at the moment of our visit. So this is signs of the work that has caused Helen to move into the middle room. Holmes walked slowly up and down the ill-trimmed lawn, and examined with deep attention the outsides of the windows. "This, I take it, belongs to the room in which you used to sleep, the centre one to your sisters, and the one next to the main building to Dr. Roylott's chamber." Holmes is talking about the windows. He's saying this window's for that room, this one for that one, and this room for Dr. Roylott's window. Right? He's basically identifying which windows are for which rooms. "Exactly so, but I am now sleeping in the middle one." "Pending the alterations, as I understand." Pending meaning while we wait for something. Helen is sleeping in the middle room while we wait for the building work to be done on the third room. So pending the alterations, as I understand. By the way, there does not seem to be any very pressing need for repairs at that end wall. "There were none. I believe that it was an excuse to move me from my room." "Ah, that is suggestive. Now, on the other side of this narrow wing runs the corridor from which these three rooms open. There are windows in it, of course?" "Yes, but very small ones, too narrow for anyone to pass through." "As you both locked your doors at night, your rooms were unapproachable from that side. Now, would you have the kindness to go into your room and bar your shutters?" Close the shutters. Holmes wants to see what it's like with the shutters closed. Miss Stoner did so, and Holmes, after a careful examination through the open window, endeavoured in every way to force the shutter open, but without success. There was no slit through which a knife could be passed to raise the bar. Then, with his lens, he tested the hinges, but they were of solid iron, built firmly into the massive masonry. Said he, scratching his chin in some perplexity. My theory certainly presents some difficulties. No one could pass these shutters if they were bolted. Well, we shall see if the inside throws any light upon the matter." So basically he's decided that the shutters, there's no way that anyone could get through these shutters if they were closed. So he's decided, let's have a look on the inside, maybe that'll show us something else. A small side door led into the whitewashed corridor from which the three bedrooms opened. Holmes refused to examine the third chamber, so we passed at once to the second, that in which Miss Stoner was now sleeping, and in which her sister had met with her fate. It was a homely little room, sort of like cosy and comfortable. It was a homely little room with a low ceiling and a gaping fireplace, after the fashion of old country houses. A brown chest of drawers stood in one corner, a narrow white counterpaned bed in another, and a dressing table on the left-hand side of the window. These articles, with two small wicker-work chairs, made up all the furniture in the room, save for a square of Wilton carpet in the centre. So this is a basic room. There's just, let's see, a brown chest of drawers, you know, with drawers for keeping clothes in and stuff in one corner, a narrow, basically a small bed in the other corner, a dressing table on the left-hand side of the window, a table with a window, a table with a mirror for getting dressed. These things, these articles were, together with a couple of chairs, were the only things in the room. except for the carpet in the centre of the floor. The boards and the panelling of the walls were of brown, worm-eaten oak, so old and discoloured that it may have dated from the original building of the house. So there's wooden panels and wooden floorboards, old wooden floorboards and wooden panels. Holmes drew one of the chairs into a corner and sat silent, while his eyes travelled round and round, up and down, taking in every detail of the apartment. "Where does that bell communicate with?" he asked at last, pointing to a thick bell rope which hung down beside the bed, the tassel actually lying upon the pillow. This is an important detail. So in the olden days, in those big houses, sometimes there would have been a rope or a string hanging from the ceiling, which the occupant of the room could pull, and you pull the rope and it's attached to a bell in another room of the house. So you pull the rope and tinkling, tinka-tinka-ting, a bell rings somewhere in the house, and it's basically a way of saying to one of the members of staff, "Excuse me, can you help me?" Or I'd like a cup of tea, please," or something like that. So there's a rope hanging down from the ceiling, the sort of thing that would be attached to a bell that you would pull, and ring, 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 the bell would ring. Okay, so there's a rope hanging down, and Holmes says, "Where does that bell communicate with?" Meaning, basically, where is the bell that this rope is attached to? And she said, "It goes to the housekeeper's room. It looks newer than the other things." So this rope with a tassel at the end, a sort of a fabric thing that hangs down from the end, a decorative thing on the end of it. He says it looks newer, it looks new. "Yes, it was only put there a couple of years ago." "Your sister asked for it, I suppose?" "No, I never heard of her using it. We used always to get what we wanted for ourselves." "Indeed, it seemed unnecessary to put so nice a bell pull there. You will excuse me for a few minutes while I satisfy myself as to this floor." So he wants to examine the floor now, after considering the bell rope, the bell pull, to be sort of a bit unnecessary. He threw himself down upon his face with his lens in his hand. So that's a magnifying glass, a glass lens that would be used to study and examine things in detail. One of the things that Sherlock Holmes is famous for, looking through a magnifying lens or a magnifying glass. He threw himself down upon his face with his lens in his hand and crawled swiftly backward and forward, examining minutely the cracks between the boards. Then he did the same with the woodwork with which the chamber was panelled. Finally he walked over to the bed and spent some time in staring at it and in running his eye up and down the wall. Finally he took the bell rope in his hand and gave it a brisk tug. He kind of pulled on the rope. "Why, it's a dummy," said he. "Won't it ring?" "No, it's not even attached to a wire." "This is very interesting. You can see now that it's fastened to a hook just above where the little opening for the ventilator is." "How very absurd! I never noticed that before." "Very strange," muttered Holmes, pulling at the rope. "There are one or two very singular points about this room. For example, what a fool a builder must be to open a ventilator into another room, when, with the same trouble, he might have communicated it with the outside air." "That is also quite modern," said the lady. "Done about the same time as the bell rope?" remarked Holmes. "Yes, there were several little changes carried out at about that time. They seem to have been of a most interesting character. Dummy bell ropes and ventilators which do not ventilate. With your permission, Miss Stoner, we shall now carry our researches into the inner apartment." So I just need to stop there. So Holmes, in exploring the room, we talked about the bell rope hanging down from the ceiling, which normally would be connected to a bell somewhere. Helen thought it was connected to a bell in the servants' room. But when Holmes pulled the rope, he realised it was a dummy. It's a fake rope. It's a fake bell rope. And it's not attached to anything. It's just attached to a hook in the ceiling next to where there is a ventilation shaft. So ventilation, this is basically something that allows air. Normally, ventilation would allow fresh air into a room. And it would be maybe a little cover or a little hole in the wall with a little shaft or a small opening, which would probably connect to the outside to allow air to come into the room. It's important to keep a room aired. But this particular ventilator doesn't connect with the outside. It connects with the next room. So there's a sort of little passage, a very small passage that goes from the ceiling of this bedroom into the next room, into Dr. Roylott's room. And hanging down next to this little opening, the ventilator, hanging down from there is this rope. Very strange. Okay. And it turns out, Helen says, that these changes, these things, the ventilator, the rope, were all fairly recent additions to the room. Dr. Grimsby Roylott's chamber was larger than that of his stepdaughter. They're now examining Dr. Grimsby Roylott's room. It was larger than that of his stepdaughter, but was as plainly furnished. A camp bed, a small wooden shelf full of books, mostly of a technical character, an armchair beside the bed, a plain wooden chair against the wall, a round table, and a large iron safe were the principal things which met the eye. A safe, by the way, is a large heavy metal box that would be used to keep like precious items. When you go to a hotel room, usually there's a little metal safe in the room with a beep, 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 like a little digital keypad on it. And, you enter the right code and the safe opens. So this kind of safe, probably a large metal box, heavy metal door. There's a safe in there as well. These are the first things that you can see. Holmes walked slowly round and examined each and all of them with the keenest interest. "What's in here?" he asked, tapping the safe. "My stepfather's business papers." "Oh, you've seen inside then?" "Only once, some years ago. I remember that it was full of papers." "There isn't a cat in it, for example?" "No, what a strange idea. A cat." "Well, look at this." He took up a small saucer of milk, which stood on the top of it. So a little saucer, little small bowl or plate full of milk was sitting on top of the safe. "No, we don't keep a cat. But there's a cheetah and a baboon." "Ah, yes, of course. Well, a cheetah is just a big cat. And yet a saucer of milk does not go very far in satisfying its wants, I dare say. There is one point which I should wish to determine." He squatted down in front of the wooden chair and examined the seat of it with the greatest attention. "Thank you, that is quite settled," said he, rising and putting his lens in his pocket. "Oh, hello! Here's something interesting." The object which had caught his eye was a small dog lash hung on one corner of the bed. I suppose a dog lash is like a dog leash, sort of thing that you would fit round the neck of a dog to take it for a walk. A small dog lash was hung on one corner of the bed. The lash, however, was curled upon itself and tied so as to make a loop of whipcord. So the lash is curled round on itself, so there's a loop at the end which you could kind of open or close. "What do you make of that, Watson?" "It's a common enough lash, but I don't know why it should be tied." "That is not quite so common, is it? Ah me, it's a wicked world. And when a clever man turns his brains to crime, it is the worst of all. I think that I have seen enough now, Miss Stoner, and with your permission, we shall walk out upon the lawn." So they're now going to go outside onto the grass. I had never seen my friend's face so grim or his brow so dark as it was when we turned from the scene of this investigation. So Holmes is looking very serious. We'd walked several times up and down the lawn, neither Miss Stoner nor myself liking to break in upon his thoughts before he roused himself from his reverie. So they walked up and down the grass, and Miss Stoner and Watson did not interrupt Holmes. They didn't want to interrupt him. They didn't want to disturb him, break into his thoughts before he kind of woke himself up from his kind of daydream, his thinking process. "It is very essential, Miss Stoner," said he, "that you should absolutely follow my advice in every respect." "I shall most certainly do so. The matter is too serious for any hesitation. Your life may depend on your compliance." "I assure you that I am in your hands." "In the first place, both my friend and I must spend the night in your room." Both Miss Stoner and I gazed at him in astonishment. They looked at him like, "What?" "Yes, it must be so. Let me explain. I believe that is the village inn over there." Meaning that's the local pub and hotel over there. Yes, that's the Crown." "Very good. Your windows would be visible from there?" "Certainly." So basically, is that the local pub and hotel? Yes, it is. And would it be possible to see your windows from that place? And she says, yes. "You must confine yourself to your room on pretence of a headache when your stepfather comes back. Then, when you hear him retire for the night, you must open the shutters of your window, undo the hasp, put your lamp there as a signal to us, and then withdraw quietly with everything which you are likely to want into the room which you used to occupy. I have no doubt that in spite of the repairs you could manage there for one night." "Oh yes, easily. The rest you will leave in our hands." Okay, so Holmes is saying to Miss Stoner that she has to go into her room and stay there until she thinks that the doctor has kind of gone to bed, and then she has to open the window and open the shutter and with her lamp give a signal to Holmes and Watson, who will be in the pub or the hotel over the road or whatever, so that they can see. And then she's going to go with anything she needs into the third room where she's going to spend the night. And she's going to leave the window open of the second room, and then Watson and Holmes are going to sneak into the room and stay there in order to see what's going on. "But what will you do? We shall spend the night in your room, and we shall investigate the cause of this noise which has disturbed you." "I believe, Mr. Holmes, that you have already made up your mind," said Miss Stoner, laying her hand upon my companion's sleeve. "Perhaps I have." "Then, for pity's sake, tell me what was the cause of my sister's death." "I should prefer to have clearer proofs before I speak." "You can at least tell me whether my own thought is correct, and if she died from some sudden fright." "No, I do not think so. I think that there was probably some more tangible cause. And now, Miss Stoner, we must leave you, for if Dr. Roylott returned and saw us, our journey would be in vain. Goodbye, and be brave, for if you will do what I have told you, you may rest assured that we shall soon drive away the dangers that threaten you." Sherlock Holmes and I had no difficulty in engaging a bedroom and sitting room at the Crown Inn. They were on the upper floor, and from our window we could command a view of the avenue gate and of the inhabited wing of Stoke Moran Manor House. At dusk we saw Dr. Grimesby Roylott drive past, his huge form looming up beside the little figure of the lad who drove him. The boy, driving the taxi. The boy had some slight difficulty in undoing the heavy iron gates, and we heard the hoarse roar of the doctor's voice, and saw the fury with which he shook his clenched fists at him, like, "Come along, boy, get on with it!" So they noticed Dr. Roylott shouting at the boy, couldn't open the gate. The trap drove on, and a few minutes later we saw a sudden light spring up among the trees as the lamp was lit in one of the sitting rooms. "Do you know, Watson," said Holmes, as we sat together in the gathering darkness, "I have really some scruples as to taking you tonight. There is a distinct element of danger." So Holmes is saying, I'm not sure I should bring you tonight because it could be really dangerous. And Watson says, "Can I be of assistance?" Holmes says, Your presence might be invaluable. Meaning, your presence might be really important. You might be very helpful. Then I shall certainly come. It is very kind of you. You speak of danger. You have evidently seen more in these rooms than was visible to me. No, but I fancy that I may have deduced a little more. I imagine that you saw all that I did. I saw nothing remarkable save the bell rope, and what purpose that could answer, I confess, is more than I can imagine. So, what has Holmes deduced? What do you think? He's seen this rope that doesn't seem to be doing anything, hanging down from this hole in the ceiling, which connects to Roylett's room. What about the whistle heard in the middle of the night? What about the clanging of the metal? There is a metal safe in Roylett's room. What caused Julia's death? What's going on? You saw the ventilator too. Yes, but I do not think that it is such a very unusual thing to have a small opening between two rooms. It was so small that a rat could hardly pass through. I knew that we should find a ventilator before we ever came to Stoke Moran. My dear Holmes. Oh, yes, I did. You remember in her statement, she said that her sister could smell Dr. Roylett's cigar. Now, of course, that suggested at once that there must be a communication between the two rooms. It could only be a small one, or it would have been remarked upon at the coroner's inquiry. I deduced a ventilator. But what harm can there be in that? Well, there is at least a curious coincidence of dates. A ventilator is made, a cord is hung, and a lady who sleeps in the bed dies. Does that not strike you? I cannot as yet see any connection. Did you observe anything very peculiar about that bed? No. It was clamped to the floor. Did you ever see a bed fastened like that before? Meaning it was like attached to the floor. I cannot say that I have. The lady could not move her bed. It must always be in the same relative position to the ventilator and to the rope, or so we may call it, since it was clearly never meant for a bell pull. Holmes! I cried. I seem to see dimly what you're hinting at. We're only just in time to prevent some subtle and horrible crime. Subtle enough, and horrible enough. When a doctor does go wrong, he is the first of criminals. He has nerve and he has knowledge. Palmer and Pritchard were among the heads of their profession. This man strikes even deeper, but I think, Watson, that we shall be able to strike deeper still. So basically, Holmes is saying that when a doctor becomes a criminal, they become like the kind of the first of all the criminals, because they have nerve, meaning they have the kind of calmness of a doctor, and they have the knowledge, the medical knowledge of how the body works. Palmer and Pritchard, these are kind of like serial killers from the Victorian era, who were both doctors as well. And Palmer and Pritchard are examples of like doctors who killed people. But this man strikes even deeper. But I think, Watson, that we shall be able to strike deeper still. But we shall have horrors enough before the night is over. For goodness sake, let us have a quiet pipe and turn our minds for a few hours to something more cheerful. So he's saying we're going to see some horrific things tonight. So let's just relax for the moment and smoke a pipe and just chill out a bit. Next, let's move on. About 9 o'clock, the light among the trees was extinguished. So Roylett's light in the sitting room went out, and all was dark in the direction of the manor house. 2 hours passed slowly away, and then suddenly, just at the stroke of 11, a single bright light shone out right in front of us. "That is our signal," said Holmes, springing to his feet. "It comes from the middle window." That means it's Helen. As we passed out, meaning as we left, he exchanged a few words with the landlord, explaining that we were going on a late visit to an acquaintance, and that it was possible that we might spend the night there. A moment later, we were out on the dark road, a chill wind blowing in our faces, and one yellow light twinkling in front of us through the gloom to guide us on our sombre errand. So they went outside, following the light from the window, There was little difficulty in entering the grounds, for unrepaired breaches gaped in the old park wall. So, it was easy to get into the grounds of the house because of these big holes in the wall. Making our way among the trees, we reached the lawn and crossed it, and were about to enter through the window, when out from a clump of laurel bushes there darted what seemed to be a hideous and distorted child, who threw itself upon the grass with writhing limbs and then ran swiftly across the lawn into the darkness. So they were just about to enter the window when they saw something jumping out from behind one of the bushes. It looked like some sort of horrible, distorted child who jumped onto the grass with sort of horribly writhing, moving arms and ran quickly across the lawn. "My God," I whispered, "did you see it?" What was this weird sort of monster? Holmes was, for the moment, as startled as I, so they both looked kind of shocked by this, startled by it. His hand closed like a vice upon my wrist in his agitation. Then he broke into a low laugh and put his lips to my ear. "It is a nice household," he murmured. "That is the baboon." So they just had a close encounter with the baboon that lived at the house, this weird monkey. I'd forgotten the strange pets which the doctor affected. There was a cheetah too. Perhaps we might find it upon our shoulders at any moment. I confess that I felt easier in my mind when, after following Holmes's example and slipping off my shoes, I found myself inside the bedroom. My companion noiselessly closed the shutters, moved the lamp onto the table, and cast his eyes around the room. All was as we had seen it in the daytime. Then, creeping up to me and making a trumpet of his hand, he whispered into my ear again, so gently that it was all that I could do to distinguish the words. "The least sound would be fatal to our plans." I nodded to show that I had heard. "We must sit without light. He would see it through the ventilator." I nodded again. "Do not go asleep. Your very life may depend upon it. Have your pistol ready in case we should need it. I will sit on the side of the bed and you in that chair." I took out my revolver and laid it on the corner of the table. Holmes had brought up a long thin cane, like a long thin stick, and this he placed upon the bed beside him. By it he laid the box of matches and the stump of a candle. Then he turned down the lamp and we were left in darkness. How shall I ever forget that dreadful vigil? I could not hear a sound, not even the drawing of a breath, and yet I knew that my companion sat open-eyed within a few feet of me, in the same state of nervous tension in which I was myself. The shutters cut off the least ray of light, and we waited in absolute darkness. So, by the way, at this point they are in the bedroom, in complete darkness. Watson is sitting in the chair. He has the gun on the side next to him. And Holmes is sitting, I think, on the bed. He's got a wooden cane, a kind of long thin wooden stick, which he's put on the side table, and a box of matches and a little candle, which I guess he can light quickly in order to illuminate the room. And they're sitting in absolute silence, because obviously next door there's Dr. Roylott, who doesn't know that they're there, and they're going to wait and see what's going to happen. From outside came the occasional cry of a night bird, and once at our very window a long-drawn cat-like whine, something like that, which told us that the cheetah was indeed at liberty. It's told us that the cheetah was free, just roaming around freely. Far away we could hear the deep tones of the parish clock, which boomed out every quarter of an hour, so they could hear the sounds of the clock from the church. How long they seemed, those quarters! Every 15 minutes. 12 struck, and 1 and 2 and 3, and still we sat waiting silently for whatever might befall. Suddenly there was the momentary gleam of a light up in the direction of the ventilator, which vanished immediately, but was succeeded by a strong smell of burning oil and heated metal. Someone in the next room had lit a dark lantern. I heard a gentle sound of movement, and then all was silent once more, though the smell grew stronger. For half an hour I sat with straining ears. Then suddenly another sound became audible, a very gentle, soothing sound, like that of a small jet of steam escaping continually from a kettle. The instant that we heard it, Holmes sprang from the bed, struck a match, and lashed furiously with his cane at the bell pull. So he starts whacking the rope with his wooden stick. "You see it, Watson?" he yelled. "You see it?" But I saw nothing. At the moment when Holmes struck the light, I heard a low, clear whistle. But the sudden glare flashing into my weary eyes made it impossible for me to tell what it was at which my friend lashed so savagely. So he couldn't see exactly what it was that Holmes was trying to hit with this stick, what he was lashing. I could, however, see that his face was deadly pale and filled with horror and loathing. So he could see Holmes's face, and Holmes is terrified while he's trying to hit this thing, whatever it is. He had ceased to strike and was gazing up at the ventilator when suddenly there broke from the silence of the night the most horrible cry to which I have ever listened. It swelled up louder and louder, a hoarse yell of pain and fear and anger, all mingled in the one dreadful shriek. So, hoarse, by the way, refers to the sound of someone's throat, like this. This is a hoarse-sounding voice. So it's not like a... not one of those horses. Horse, spelled H-O-A-R-S-E. A hoarse yell, meaning a sound made by someone's voice. So they suddenly, in the middle of the night, after this strange moment has occurred, they hear this horrible scream, this horrible cry. Ah! Something like that. A hoarse yell of pain and fear and anger, all mingled in one dreadful shriek. Ah! Ah! Like that. They say that away down in the village, and even in the distant parsonage, where the parson lives, where the local priest lives, that cry raised the sleepers from their beds. It struck cold to our hearts, and I stood gazing at Holmes, and he at me, until the last echoes of it had died away into the silence from which it rose. So they just stood, they sat there staring at each other while this no Arnold Schwarzenegger involved in this. Anyway, what can it mean? I gasped. It means that it is all over, Holmes answered. And perhaps, after all, it is for the best. Take your pistol, and we will enter Dr. Roylott's room. With a grave face, like with a serious face, he lit the lamp and led the way down the corridor. Twice he struck at the chamber door, without any reply from within. Then he turned the handle and entered, I at his heels, with the cocked pistol in my hand. It was a singular sight which met our eyes, meaning a sort of like unique sight. On the table stood a dark lantern with the shutter half open, throwing a brilliant beam of light upon the iron safe, the door of which was ajar. So if the door is ajar, it means it's slightly open. Beside this table, on the wooden chair, sat Mr. Grimesby Roylott, clad in a long grey dressing gown, his bare ankles protruding beneath, and his feet thrust into red heelless Turkish slippers. So Grimesby Roylott is sitting in this chair. Across his lap lay the short stock with the long lash, which we had noticed during the day. So this is that short, like kind of like dog leash with a little loop on the end that's lying on his lap in front of him. His chin was cocked upward, and his eyes were fixed in a dreadful rigid stare at the corner of the ceiling. So Its face is like locked in this staring at the ceiling. Round his brow, so round the sort of front of the top of his head, above his eyes, like where a tennis player would wear a headband. So round his brow he had a peculiar yellow band with brownish speckles, which seemed to be bound tightly round his head. There's something kind of wrapped round his head. As we entered, he made neither sound nor motion. So he didn't make a sound and he didn't move. "The band! The speckled band!" whispered Holmes. I took a step forward. In an instant, his strange headgear, this strange thing around his head, began to move. And there reared itself from among his hair the squat, diamond-shaped head and puffed neck of a loathsome serpent. So this speckled band, what looked like a band around his head, suddenly started to move, and then from his hair the head of a snake moved upwards. "It is a swamp adder," cried Holmes, "the deadliest snake in India. He has died within 10 seconds of being bitten. Violence does, in truth, recoil upon the violent, and the schemer falls into the pit which he digs for another." So this is the solution to this whole mystery. It's a snake. The speckled band is the body of a snake. And it's this snake which Roylott has been using as a kind of weapon. This has actually bitten him. Let us thrust this creature back into its den, and we can then remove Miss Stoner to some place of shelter and let the county police know what has happened. So Holmes wants to put the snake back into the safe. As he spoke, he drew the dog whip swiftly from the dead man's lap, and throwing the noose around the reptile's neck, he drew it from its horrid perch, and carrying it at arm's length, threw it into the iron safe, which he closed upon it. Poor snake. It's not his fault, is it? Such are the true facts of the death of Dr. Grimesby Roylott of Stoke Moran. It is not necessary that I should prolong a narrative which has already run to too great a length by telling how we broke the sad news to the terrified girl, how we conveyed her by the morning train to the care of her good aunt in Harrow, of how the slow process of official inquiry came to the conclusion that the doctor met his fate while indiscreetly playing with a dangerous pet. The little which I had yet to learn of the case was told me by Sherlock Holmes as we travelled back the next day. "I had," said he, "come to an entirely erroneous conclusion, which shows, my dear Watson, how dangerous it always is to reason from insufficient data." So basically he's saying he'd got the wrong conclusion. He'd come to the wrong conclusion about this, which shows that it's dangerous to make your conclusions from when you don't have enough data. The presence of the gypsies and the use of the word band, which was used by the poor girl, no doubt, to explain the appearance which she had caught a hurried glimpse of by the light of her match, were sufficient to put me upon an entirely wrong scent. Scent is smell, so a bit like a dog would be sniffing for a smell to investigate something. Something can put you on the wrong scent, meaning can sort of send you on the wrong line of inquiry. I can only claim the merits that I instantly reconsidered my position when, however, it became clear to me that whatever danger threatened an occupant of the room could not come either from the window or the door. My attention was speedily drawn, as I have already remarked to you, to this ventilator and to the bell rope which hung down to the bed. The discovery that this was a dummy, meaning a fake one, and that the bed was clamped to the floor instantly gave rise to the suspicion that the rope was there as a bridge for something passing through the hole and coming to the bed. The idea of a snake instantly occurred to me, and when I coupled it with my knowledge that the doctor was furnished with a supply of creatures from India, I felt that I was probably on the right track. The idea of using a form of poison which could not possibly be discovered by any chemical test was just such a one as would occur to a clever and ruthless man who had had an Eastern training. The rapidity with which such a poison would take effect would also, from his point of view, be an advantage. It would be a sharp-eyed coroner, indeed, who could distinguish the two little dark punctures which would show where the poison fangs had done their work. Then I thought of the whistle. Of course, he must recall the snake before the morning light revealed it to the victim. He had trained it, probably by the use of the milk which we saw, to return to him when summoned. He would put it through this ventilator at the hour that he thought best, with the certainty that it would crawl down the rope and land on the bed. It might or might not bite the occupant. Perhaps she might escape every night for a week, but sooner or later she must fall a victim. I had come to these conclusions before ever I had entered his room. An inspection of his chair showed me that he had been in the habit of standing on it, which of course would be necessary in order that he should reach the ventilator. The sight of the safe, the saucer of milk, and the loop of whipcord were enough to finally dispel any doubts which may have remained. The metallic clang heard by Miss Stoner was obviously caused by her stepfather hastily closing the door of his safe upon its terrible occupant. Having once made up my mind, you know the steps which I took in order to put the matter to the proof. I heard the creature hiss, as I have no doubt that you did also, and I instantly lit the light and attacked it. Poor snake. With the result of driving it through the ventilator, and also with the result of causing it to turn upon its master at the other side. Some of the blows of my cane came home and roused its snakish temper, so that it flew upon the first person it saw. In this way I am no doubt indirectly responsible for Dr. Grimesby Roylott's death, and I cannot say that it is likely to weigh very heavily upon my conscience. Right, that's the end. So that's where Holmes explained what happened, that he is indirectly responsible for Roylott's death. So what happened is that they were in the room. Roylott woke up at 3:30 a.m. or whatever and decided now was the time to send the snake into the room, which apparently he did every night, hoping that he would, just like he'd done with Julia, bringing about her death, he would do the same thing to Helen now that she was engaged to be married, right? This was his way of secretly killing her in a way that no doctor could identify, you know. Quite a plan. So he trained the snake. He trained the snake to go through the ventilator and down the rope. Somehow he'd been using the little bowl of milk to help train the snake. I don't know, can you train a snake? I suppose you can. I mean, you see snake charmers and things they can do. Apparently he learned some of these tricks in his time in India, how to train a snake. I don't know. You have to an extent, you have to kind of be willing to go along with the story. You have to suspend your disbelief in some of these situations and just enjoy the story. So he trained the snake to go through the ventilator and down the rope, where it would then drop onto the bed, and sooner or later it would bite the occupant, and then, I suppose with the little whistle, he would call the snake back through the ventilator, where he would then put it into the safe where no one could see it. This is what he tried to do, but Holmes and Watson were in the room this time. Holmes heard the hissing sound of the snake. He already knew that it was a snake. He'd deduced this. He'd worked this out. So he hit the snake. The poor snake, I know. He hit the snake with the stick. The snake got really angry and went back through the ventilator and just attacked the first human that it saw, which was Roylott in this case. Roylott got bitten by his own snake. So the violence which he'd been dealing out upon the girls in the end returned to attack him. So he was victim of his own violence. And Holmes says, although I was indirectly responsible for Dr. Roylott's death, I don't this is not likely to weigh very heavily on my conscience. So it's not going to be on his conscience. He's not going to feel guilty about it because as far as Holmes is concerned, justice has been done. The police decided that Roylott died due to an accident with him, playing with his pet snake, and that's that. Okay, listeners, did you manage to follow this? Some people are currently just skeletons in front of their computers or their phones or whatever. I don't know, but then a lot of you aren't. So if you are not a skeleton, then good for you. You survived all the way through. I hope you enjoyed this story. I hope my explanations have helped. What I'm going to do now, just at the end, is kind of just give you a summary of the whole story in chronological order. This will just take a couple of minutes. This is, in my words, a summary of the whole chronology of this story. So, the Roylott family were one of the oldest Anglo-Saxon families in England, a noble family, kind of connected to the royal family. That's what the nobility is. Upper class noble family, like the family in Downton Abbey, right? That's another noble family. So that's the Roylott family. But over successive generations, the family's fortune, that's their money and the land that they owned, their fortune had been lost. And so when Grimesby Roylott inherited the estate, there was almost no money left, almost no land left except the house and its grounds, which were in very bad condition. And Grimesby Roylott is the sole remaining heir of the estate. He's just him. Grimesby decided that he needed to learn professional skills in order to earn money, so he trained to be a doctor. He moved to India, where he lived and practiced as a doctor. While living there, he married a woman who had 2 twin daughters, Julia and Helen. They became his stepdaughters. Now, Grimesby was a very nasty and mean man, like his ancestors, apparently. Apparently, he was sort of like ran in the family. And he got in trouble when he had a furious argument with his Indian butler over some robberies in the house, and he killed him. He beat him to death. He's a murderer. He spent time in prison in India because of this, before moving back to England with his wife and his 2 stepdaughters. Now, his wife later died in a train accident. So Grimesby was left to live in the old house with his stepdaughters. Now, Grimesby's time in India and in prison and the death of his wife had changed him. He became even more bad-tempered, more aggressive and antisocial. He had violent encounters with almost everyone he met. His habits were strange. He kept several exotic and dangerous animals, which he had acquired in India, and often let them move freely in the house and gardens. And he befriended some gypsies, travelling people. He let them stay on his land and would sometimes go and stay with them in their tents. These are the only people he socialised with. The 2 stepdaughters had inherited some money when their mother died, and clearly Grimesby wanted this money. When one of the girls got engaged, Grimesby pretended to be happy with the engagement, but secretly he planned to have the girl killed so he could take her inheritance, money, because without it he would be almost penniless. He planned her murder very carefully so that nobody could understand how it had happened, or that he was the murderer. Now, there's one problem here, I suppose. It seems obvious that he did it, right? Anyone looking at the situation, you would think, well, he's clearly the number one suspect. Clear motive and no other obvious cause of death. Everyone would definitely assume it was him. But I suppose without enough evidence, then there's nothing that could be done, to put him in prison. But he's clearly the number one suspect, right? I mean, he's already committed murder in the past. He's a absolutely horrible, cruel and violent scumbag. So he's definitely going to do it. He's definitely going to be the one who did it. But I guess without the evidence, no one can prosecute him, right? That's probably the thing. I suppose his cruelty and evil were more powerful forces in him than his intelligence or reason, I suppose. Now, as well as the baboon and the cheetah, Grimesby had also acquired a very poisonous snake, which he kept in a safe in his room. Holmes described it as a swamp adder. Apparently there's no such snake in India as a swamp adder. Probably the closest thing would be the cobra, something like that. Anyway, he trained the snake to go into Julia's room, where it would probably bite her. He installed a ventilation shaft which connected the two rooms, actually just to allow the snake to move into Julia's room and back again, and hung a bell pull rope from the ceiling next to the ventilation hole, which hung down onto Julia's bed. He trained the snake to go through the ventilation shaft, slither down the rope and onto the bed where it would bite Julia, and then when he whistled, the snake would come back up the rope through the ventilator and back into his bedroom. The bed in Julia's room was attached to the floor, making sure that it was always in the right position for the rope. Grimesby used a dog leash with a loop in it to catch the snake and move it around, putting it back into the safe. This is what he did, and this is how Julia was killed. Her sister Helen heard her scream when she was bitten and rushed to help her. She heard the sound of Grimesby in the next room closing the heavy metal door of the safe where the snake was kept. While dying, Julia said something about the speckled band. She was trying to describe the snake, trying to describe what it looked like. When her body was examined, nobody thought about the possibility of a snake bite and didn't notice the small holes where the snake's fangs had bitten her. Snake bites are not common in the UK, and so nobody would consider this or notice it. The venom of this snake is instantly lethal, and also no tests for poison would have detected it. So it's kind of like this perfect crime in a way. When Helen got engaged too, after several years of living this terrifying life, subjected to Grimesby's cruel treatment, her stepfather also accepted the proposal, but then planned to kill Helen in the same way, the idiot. He pretended to start repair work on the wall of the house, making Helen move into the middle bedroom, the one with the bell pull rope, attached bed, etc. And there he tried his plan again. Helen heard the sound of Grimesby calling to the snake, the whistle, but she wasn't bitten. Feeling terrified and not understanding the situation, she went to Sherlock Holmes for help. Holmes thought that the gypsies might be involved, perhaps working for Grimesby and entering Julia's bedroom through the window and doing something. He thought the word band in Speckled band meant a band of people, a band of gypsies, a group of gypsies maybe, but this was a red herring. A red herring, by the way, is something that leads you in the wrong direction, like a thing that distracts you from the real solution or the real answer to the mystery. So it's a piece of evidence which distracts you away from the truth. That's a red herring. Herring is a kind of fish. So the gypsies were actually a red herring. The dangerous animals, the cheetah and the baboon, were also a red herring, kind of. Neither of them were actually involved in the killing, but it did make Holmes realise that perhaps Grimesby had other dangerous animals, in this case a snake, which could be trained to enter the room and bite the victim. So it helped Holmes deduce that it was a snake that was involved, especially when you consider the ventilation shaft. Holmes and Watson went to the house while Grimesby wasn't there and investigated. Holmes noticed these things. There was no way to enter the window from the outside. There were no secret doors or trapdoors in the room. Also, the chimney was not... you couldn't get through the chimney. The bell pull rope was fake. It wasn't attached to a bell and was just hooked to the ceiling next to the ventilator opening. The ventilator didn't communicate with the outside, which would be normal to get fresh air, but instead with Grimesby's room. The bed was attached to the floor under the ventilator and rope. So Holmes worked out that clearly, whatever happened, it was not anyone entering the room. It was something else. And all the rope, the bed, the ventilator all helped Holmes to deduce or work out that clearly Grimesby was sending something through the ventilator and down the rope. A snake seemed to be the obvious answer. In Grimesby's room, there was the other end of the ventilator shaft. There was a closed safe on the floor with a saucer of milk on top. There was a dog leash tied in a loop. It was clear that Grimesby used to stand on the chair regularly. Holmes worked out that this was so Grimesby could put, in this case a snake, into the ventilator using the dog leash. Holmes decided that they needed to spend a night in the room to see what would happen, so Holmes could see if a snake would come from the ceiling. So when Grimesby had settled in his room, Helen opened the window, moved to the other room, and Holmes and Watson climbed in through the open window and waited silently. At about 3 a.m, they noticed Grimesby's light turning on. Eventually they heard the snake coming through the ventilator, hissing as it came. Holmes was ready and attacked the snake with a cane. Poor snake. The snake went back through the ventilator and bit Grimesby in his room. Grimesby screamed and died. Holmes decided, although he'd indirectly led to Grimesby's death, that he wouldn't feel guilty about it because justice had been done. And that is that. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget you can get the PDF and the whole text that I've just been reading from in the link in the description or on my website if you want to check out specific words and things. But overall, I just really hope you enjoyed this classic Sherlock Holmes story. Leave your comments in the comments section. Did you work out what was going on? Did you know what was going to happen? Are you as clever as Sherlock Holmes? What did you think? Any idea? Just leave your thoughts in the comments section. And if you made it this far, I don't know, what? Let's say, leave a comment about justice. Something to do with justice. And by the way, Helen eventually went and lived with her aunt in Harrow, which seemed to be a much happier existence. So, leave a comment mentioning justice in the comment section if you got this far. I really hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed reading it to you. I will speak to you again in the next episode, but for now, it's just time to say goodbye. Bye. Bye. Bye.